Welcome to Ride High, Cowboy, the podcast that brings you the true crimes of Wyoming. So without further ado, let's saddle up and take a historical ride through the Old West. In the 1880s, Chinese immigration to the United States was not common, nor was it uniform. As swaths of people flooded into the United States, the Chinese populations didn't tend to follow the norms set by other groups. However, the majority of the almost 100,000 Chinese immigrants coming in per year settled in states like California, Nevada, and Oregon, as well as the Washington Territory, according to the then U.S. Minister to China, George Seward. Many of these immigrants made their way to Wyoming, finding work as laborers with the Union Pacific Railroad. They were called maintenance of way workers and worked along the Union Pacific lines as well as in the railroad-owned coal mines from Laramie to Evanston, Wyoming. Many of these workers made their homes in Sweetwater County, which housed Rock Springs, Wyoming. As the railroad finished up, the Chinese men found steady work in the coal mines in the area and settled down to make a life for themselves. The people of Wyoming found their new neighbors confusing. There was little interaction between Wyoming and Asia during that time, and the immigrants had strange ways about them. They were noted as, quote, alien in blood, habits, and civilization, end quote, by J.R. Tucker, a writer of the time for the North American Review. These new Wyomingites were willing to work for lower wages than the locals and in more harsh conditions. In 1875, labor unrest amongst the locals disrupted the coal production by the Union Pacific Coal Department, and in retaliation, UP hired many Chinese immigrants to supplement their labor needs at cheaper prices. At first, the Chinese population rose slowly in Rock Springs. A few new arrivals here and there, and they seemed to stick to their own. Labor camps were popular in the area, and the Chinese had chosen to create their own at Red Desert in Sweetwater County. Out of the 20 men working in the area, 12 were Chinese, and they all worked under an American foreman. To the east of Red Desert was another work camp named Washakie, which housed 24 men, including 13 Chinese and an Irish crew foreman. It was evident that the Chinese were beginning to outnumber the other nationalities in the camps. In total, there were 79 Chinese working and living in Sweetwater County by 1870, and they were forming their own concentrations within the towns. During the 1870s, Wyoming's population was skyrocketing. The state went from under 10,000 residents to over 20,000, with 143 of them being classified as Asian and Pacific Islanders on the census. During this time, Wyoming saw the largest increase in Asians of any decade before or since, with a 539% increase. By 1880, the Chinese in Rock Springs had begun holding jobs outside of the mines. However, the majority still mined coal. By 1882, the United States had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, signed by President Arthur, which stated in part that, quote, from and after the expiration of 90 days next after the passage of this act, and until the expiration of 10 years next after the passage of this act, the coming of Chinese laborers to the United States be, and the same is hereby, suspended. And during such suspension, it shall not be lawful for any Chinese laborers to come, end quote. It had been a common sentiment that Chinese labor was a system worse than slavery, and the white miners in Rock Springs believed that the lower-paid Chinese workers were bringing down wages for every miner. The animosity towards the Chinese wasn't a secret, and they were well aware of the rising tension amongst the other miners. The Chinese were unfazed. They were here same as them, to make their money and build their life. The only difference was that the Chinese laborers were willing to do it for less, resulting in more and more foremen hiring them over the others who would cost more money. The Chinese took no precautions against the evident hatred brewing against them. In 1883, Whitemanstown was established in Rock Springs as a working camp. The Knights of Labor, a labor union of sorts, organized a chapter within the town and began spearheading the opposition to the Chinese labor. They were active proponents of the Chinese Exclusion Act in an attempt to ensure living wages were paid to employees. In August of 1885, notices began appearing all over town demanding the expulsion and removal of Chinese immigrants. And on September 1st, 1885, the legacy miners, those who had been mining since the UP's inception within the town, held a meeting about how to handle the onslaught of Chinese immigrants taking over the town and driving wages down for everyone. Until 1885, the majority of the miners in Rock Springs were white, mostly Cornish, Irish, Swedish, and Welsh immigrants. But that year they went on strike against the Union Pacific Coal Department. To replace the lost labor, the UP filled those positions with cheap Chinese labor within 2 weeks of the strike's beginning. The company resumed mining with 50 white miners and 150 Chinese miners. News quickly spread, and more Chinese laborers began flooding into Rock Springs, taking as many jobs as they could for, to the joy of the UP Coal Department, lower wages than had previously been paid. As the weeks went on, UP ended up with only 150 legacy miners and 330 Chinese miners. At 7 a.m. on September 2nd, 1885, 10 American miners arrived at coal pit number 6 in Rock Springs. They declared that the Chinese had no right to work at the mines, specifically a specific room within the mine that they had deemed the most desirable to work in. Miners were paid by the ton, which meant that location was incredibly important to ensure a good wage was made each day. The 10 men, some in miners' uniforms and others in streetwear, were adamant that the Chinese be moved to another area. A brawl ensued, and 2 Chinese men within the pit were badly beaten, with one later dying of his injuries. The 10 men, having finished the fight, walked out of the mine as casually as they had entered. Work at coal pit number 6 was stopped temporarily, and more American miners gathered near town. Carrying firearms and weapons, they followed the train tracks to the center of Rock Springs. By 10 a.m., the bell located at the Knights of Labor meeting hall had begun to ring, and the miners within exited to join the miners now entering town, emerging as a large group of around 150 men. As word quickly spread, Union Pacific began to panic. By 2 p.m., the UP Coal Department hurriedly persuaded the saloons and grocers to close down for their safety. It's also believed that UP didn't want the converging miners to begin, or continue, drinking in such a contentious situation. The miners, well armed and thoroughly angered, began marching to Chinatown, located within Rock Springs, where the Chinese immigrants had set up their camps. The men moved in 2 groups and entered upon Chinatown from both sides, a larger group by way of the railroad bridge, and the smaller from the opposite end using the town's plank bridge. A few men stayed back on either side to stand watch. The larger group broke off into smaller groups and moved uphill towards coal pit number 3 and took stand at the coal shed, another small group at the pump house. A warning party had been sent ahead of the men. They had warned the Chinese that the men were an hour out and that they needed to pack up and leave before they got there. But after only 30 minutes, the first gunshot rang out. It had come from the pump house, and within moments more gunshots could be heard from the coal shed. Lor Sun Kit, a Chinese laborer, was the first casualty of what would be known as the Rock Springs Riot. The men continued on, breaking out into smaller groups to surround Chinatown with others guarding any exit points. This was the last stand for the rights of miners. There would be no escape. As the American miners moved in closer, the Chinese became aware of the seriousness of the situation. Liu Daiba and Yip Ah Marn became the next 2 to die as the men made their way into the center of the camp. The Chinese tried to flee, grabbing what they could carry and looking for any way out. Confusion led the Chinese laborers as they fled in every direction, a flurry of screams and bullets and blood. The men had them surrounded on 3 sides. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. As the American miners made their way through, they stopped every Chinese man they saw, asking if he had a gun, searching his person, and taking anything of value, from watches to gold and silver. Some of the miners had mercy and let their captives go, running into the yellowing prairie fields. Others weren't so lucky. Some were beaten with the butts of the guns carried by the American miners before being released, while others were shot on the spot. No mercy, no discussion, just death. While some of the American miners took their vengeance through rage, others through theft, and yet others through murder, Some men stood by, watching, laughing, and heckling as the Chinese were beaten, robbed, bloodied, bruised, and shot in cold blood. By 3:30 p.m. that day, the massacre had gained ground and attention. Women were now gathering at the plank bridge, cheering on for the legacy miners. It's speculated that 2 of the women took part in shooting at the Chinese laborers from their spot on the bridge. The riot raged on into the night, and as the 150 legacy miners tore through Chinatown, the Chinese laborers ran into the surrounding hills, hiding in the tall grass as they watched the legacy miners set fire to their homes and buildings that had been built by the coal company. By 9 p.m., only one building stood, but it was slowly embering down to the beams. It'd be gone by morning. 79 Chinese camp houses were nothing but ashes, with damage estimated at $147,000. In today's money, that would be $4,751,706.80. Bodies of the Chinese laborers were strewn throughout the town, lying lifeless on the banks of Bitter Creek, others along the railroad bridge, and yet more burned alive in their homes. The sheer brutality of the violence was heard throughout the country as news of the riots made its way into newspaper headlines from Chicago to California. Stories of Chinese miners being scalped, mutilated, branded, decapitated, their bodies hung from rain spouts as warnings to others. The Rock Springs riot took only a day. 28 Chinese men were confirmed dead, another 15 wounded. But those were only the bodies they found. It's heavily rumored that the actual death count was closer to 50. With no roster of men living in Chinatown and inaccurate counts of the number of Chinese men who fled the camp successfully, there's no way of knowing. Bodies of men who had tried to dig into the ground while their houses burned around them in the last-ditch effort to save themselves. Perhaps some did. Within a few days, fleeing Chinese laborers were able to escape to Evanston, Wyoming, about 100 miles away from Rock Springs, using the Union Pacific trains for transportation. But their plight was not over. Evanston, much like Rock Springs, had its own uproar against the influx of Chinese immigrants taking jobs at lower pay and driving down wages for the American labor force. The Chinese laborers were subjected to threats of violence and murder. Rumors began spreading that Chinese laborers were being brought back to Rock Springs from Evanston by U.S. Army troops. Those rumors were soon confirmed by the Rock Springs Independent newspaper, stating in an article that, quote, "It means that Rock Springs is killed, as far as white men are concerned, if such program is carried out," end quote. The local paper defended the massacre. Other state publications decried the actions of the legacy miners, but supported their cause and sentiment. Governor Francis E. Warren, whom you may know from the F.E. Warren Air Force Base that was named for him in Cheyenne, Wyoming, visited Rock Springs in the aftermath of the riot on September 3rd. He then made his way to Evanston to view the scene there as well. He sent telegrams to President Grover Cleveland appealing for the federal troops to come in and assist, stating that the riot had calmed, but the situation was still unstable. On September 5th, 2 of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry arrived, 1 troop in Rock Springs and the other in Evanston. Colonel McCook at Camp Murray in the Utah Territory sent an additional 6 more companies to assist. On September 9th, 1885, 1 week after the massacre, 6 companies of soldiers arrived in Wyoming. 4 of the 6 companies then escorted the Chinese back to Rock Springs. Once back in Rock Springs, the Chinese laborers found scorched tracts of land where their homes once stood. The mining company had buried only a few dead. Others remained lying in the open, mangled, decomposing, and partially eaten by dogs, hogs, and other animals. By September 15th, Rock Springs had calmed, but the mines remained closed. However, Union Pacific Coal Department continued to use Chinese labor, resulting in another walkout of white miners in Carbon County, Wyoming, on September 30th. By October 5th, the emergency U.S. troops left Rock Springs, leaving only 2 companies that would remain in the areas until 1899, due to ongoing warring in other areas, including the Spanish-American War. The American miners in Rock Springs never re-entered the mines due to the ongoing use of Chinese labor by the mining company. The labor strikes that began this riot were ultimately unsuccessful, and the miners were allowed back to work within a few months. The Knights of Labor quietly left, refusing to back any further strikes or negotiations. They refused to support any miners working for the Union Pacific Railroad due to the violence, and when the mines in Rock Springs did finally reopen, 45 white miners were immediately fired due to connections with the riot. A total of 16 men were arrested in connection with the riot in Rock Springs, including Isaiah Washington, who was a member-elect to the territorial legislature. The men were held in a Green River, Wyoming jail, but a grand jury refused to bring indictments. They declared there was no cause for legal action, stating, quote, "We have diligently inquired into the occurrence at Rock Springs. Though we have examined a large number of witnesses, no one has been able to testify to a single criminal act committed by any known white person that day." End quote. Those arrested were released on October 7, 1885, to several hundred men, women, and children celebrating them. No person was ever convicted of any crime associated with the riot. After the riot, the U.S. government hesitated to make amends to the Chinese for the massacre. In China, the Governor-General of the Guangdong region suggested that Americans in China might be the target of revenge for the events in Rock Springs. The American envoy to China, Charles Harvey Denby, and others in the diplomatic corps reported rising anti-American sentiment in Hong Kong and in Guangdong following the riot. American diplomats warned their government that the backlash from the massacre could ruin U.S. trade with China, and they also reported that British merchants and newspapers in China were encouraging the Chinese to stand up for their oppressed countrymen in America. Charles advised that U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Bayard obtain compensation for the victims of the massacre. The U.S. government agreed to financially compensate for the damaged property, but nothing else. Senator Bayard expressed in a letter to the Minister of China that he personally felt that the violence was due to the inability of the Chinese laborers to culturally assimilate, and that racism towards Chinese persons was typically found among other immigrants, and not the majority of the populace. He stated, quote, "Chinese immigrants segregate themselves from the rest of the residents and citizens of the United States, and refuse to mingle with the mass of population. As a consequence, race prejudice has been more excited against them, notably among aliens of other nationalities." End quote. Ultimately, the U.S. gave a monetary gift of $147,748.74 as an indemnity. Correspondence between Wyoming's territorial governor, Francis Warren, and Union Pacific officials during Warren's term in office indicate that he had petitioned the company for years to clear the titles of land he owned. He condemned the riot as the most brutal and damnable outrage that ever occurred in any country. As time went on, Rock Springs was compared to Sodom and Gomorrah by the New York Times. Local papers continued their sympathy for the legacy miners. Within the United States, a rhetoric of racism echoed throughout against Chinese immigrants, with many national publications, such as News Magazine, characterizing them as weak and defenseless, stating in its coverage of the massacre, quote, "To murder an industrious Chinaman is the same kind of fiendish work as the murder of women and children. It is equally a violation of the rights of the defenseless." End quote. Knights of Labor leader Terence Powderly wrote in a letter to W. W. Stone that, "It is not necessary for me to speak of the numerous reasons given for the opposition to this particular race, their habits, religion, customs, and practices." Powderly blamed the problem of Chinese immigration on the failings of the 1882 Exclusion Act. He faulted lax law enforcement, not those involved in the riots, for the attacks at Rock Springs. Powderly wrote that the U.S. Congress should stop, quote, "winking at violations of this statute," end quote, and reform the laws which barred Chinese immigration, which he believed could have prevented incidences such as the recent assault upon the Chinese at Rock Springs. In December 1885, President Cleveland presented his State of the Union address to Congress, stating, "All of the power of this government should be exhorted to maintain the amplest good faith towards China in the treatment of these men, and the inflexible sternness of the law must be insisted upon. Race prejudice is the chief factor to originating these disturbances." The Wild West of Wyoming, though one of the smaller populations and communities, was often a starting point for the events that took place in other states during this time. Minimal law, maximum land, and a lot of money to be made. Wyoming in the 1800s could be someone's fortune or someone's destitution. It was a roll of the dice with murder and mayhem around every corner. Anyone could become someone in Wyoming. You just had to fight for it. As Tom Rea put it in his article on the Rock Springs riot, thanks to Governor Warren's decisive courage in the first days after the riot, many more killings were avoided. But Warren also refused to help with the back pay question and helped trick the Chinese onto the train that took them back to Rock Springs. These actions kept a big supply of Chinese miners around, making sure coal kept flowing from the mines to run the railroad and making it easier for the company to resist demands from the white miners for higher wages. And that was what the Union Pacific had wanted to do all along. Thank you for listening. I'm Blue, and this has been one of many stories from Ride High Cowboy.